Okay, let's get going. So firstly, thank you very much for joining this EMEA focused NAS backup session from Veeam. Um, Obviously, given the circumstances, we're all stuck at home, so we need something to do and something to listen to and watch. So thank you for attending this. So who am I? So I'm Michael Cade. I'm a senior global technologist at Veeam. I sit in the product strategy group. What does that actually mean? Is that I work very closely with our product management guys, and I work very closely with our product marketing to give your feedback as customers, as partners, as alliances back into our product management, and that helps define where we go next from a product point of view. I report into our CTO over there. So yeah, the premise of the session is really going to focus on that NAS backup that came in version 10, so just over a month ago now. And really, we're gonna get into what are we actually doing here? Why are we different? What should you be considering out there from a protecting that unstructured data? Hopefully the sound's all good. I see a couple of messages where I was a bit quiet just to let everyone else jump in, but hopefully everyone's sorted now. First thing to mention, so questions. Absolutely, we want to hear questions around this that you've got around NAS backup. I will try halfway through at various different points to try and answer those questions if I don't answer them through the slides and through the demo. Also, their contact details. So on Twitter, Michael Cade1, and also my email address is there. Feel free to provide me any feedback and questions that you have, as obviously as well as your local SEs. They can also probably help a bit quicker than me. Okay, so just a bit of housekeeping. So about this webinar, so when you joined, you were automatically on mute. That's going to continue to be the same, but you've got that questions tab to be able to ask us some of the Q&A questions that you've got. Get this question a lot. The recordings will absolutely be available afterwards, as well as the presentation. So don't feel like you're having to screen grab everything. Everything's going to be available afterwards, including the recording and the presentation. Okay, so what we're going to get into. So first of all, let's talk about NAS backup. Let's talk about why it's taken us potentially 13 years to deliver something that allows you to protect your unstructured data. We're going to walk through the components that we use to protect that data. We're going to have a look at where we store that data in terms of repositories. We're going to look at what management options we have with that. We're going to look at the Veeam Backup Replication from a management point of view, but we're also going to look at other aspects and other components that we have within the Veeam family that allow us to do that. Although this is called NAS backup, there are other use cases that we have there, and we've seen already in that short window that we've had version 10 out, we're also seeing additional use cases out there, and I want to just give you a bit of an overview of what those look like as well. And then hopefully, if we've got time, but I'll try and do it as we go through because I think it's a little bit more interactive that way. We'll answer those questions. One thing I didn't put on the agenda is that we're absolutely going to jump into a demo. We're going to have a look at the simplicity of how we actually set up a share, how we start protecting that share, and then we're also going to run through some of the recovery scenarios as well. So it's not just going to be a slideware session. Okay, so let's talk about NAS backup and why now. So hopefully, if you're existing Veeam customers, if you're new to Veeam, but you've seen Veeam, then you know that we don't generally just release something to tick an RFP or tick a box to say, yes, we can do something. We generally look at a problem, a challenge, and we want to make that better. So NDMP has been the de facto way of being able to protect unstructured data NAS devices for the best part of 20 years. And with that is, if we look at the screen that I've got, it started in 96 and the development has already stopped over 10 years ago now for NDMP based solutions. But we still have the challenge out there that a lot of our legacy backup and data management tools still leverage that NDMP protocol, and there's a lot of challenges around that. So we didn't want to obviously just tick a box and just jump on that NDMP bandwagon. So first of all, for those, I'm sure the ones on the call are fully aware of this, but let's just clear up one thing as to, I'm going to flip between calling it unstructured data and NAS, and ultimately this is a great definition of what structured and unstructured data actually looks like. So if we think about structured data, we think of it in terms of a database, CRM system, etc. It's very rigid. It's very much you know exactly where this data resides, in what table, in which function that resides. Whereas unstructured data, and the best way to describe this is your home directory. This is where you keep all of your user data. This is where you keep all of your profile data, your imagery, the stuff that you don't necessarily, you know where it is, but you don't know like how it's stored, and you don't know some of the characteristics of it, the size, etc., without putting some sort of structure over the top of that. So moving on to what are the NAS challenges for today, and I'm sure all of you either tick all of these boxes or at least have some of these challenges. And this is all played into why now, why for Veeam have we approached NAS Backup today. So we hear it on every single presentation that we hear, especially when we're talking about data growing exponentially. We hear about the file size, the actual raw data that is growing exponentially as well. It's no longer, we're not just talking about gigs and terabytes of data, we're talking about petabytes of data. Then we've also got the challenge around governance and compliance. We have to keep things for longer, and just the nature of humans, we're constantly hoarding everything. So no one wants to delete anything because we might need it for personal use, we might need it for some use, or we may never know, and we hoard everything in our private lives as well. But ultimately, we don't have any visibility into what that data is doing in a very concise manner. Then let's flip back to, okay, so why didn't we just tick the box of an NDMP based solution? So NDMP is very limited in how it takes those backups. And if you couple those challenges around data growing exponentially, having to do full data dumps, so on a weekly basis, potentially on a Friday afternoon, we have to take a full backup, and that hopefully will finish before Monday and we come back into work. And that's saying that you're a Monday to Friday business. There's not very many companies out there now that can afford to have that impact to performance, because we're a 24/7 shop. So NDMP had it. That's the first challenge with NDMP. Secondly is that when it comes to recovery, we have to recover an NDMP based solution or NDMP based backup back to the original location. So if you've taken it from vendor A, you have to recover to vendor A. There's no flexibility when it comes to that restoration. And thirdly is we have to do that weekly backup, because although NDMP as a protocol has a definition of you can take 10 so you could take your first day full backup, and in theory you can take 10 incrementals before having to take another full backup. A lot of those legacy vendors out there that leverage NDMP based technologies, they actually pulled down that ceiling to around 7 or 6 days, so that then you have to go and take a full backup on the 7th day or on the 6th day. And that means that we're going to have to go back, we're going to have to go and crawl through the whole production source again, and we're going to have to walk through the whole file system. So a huge challenge from that perspective. Okay, so what do we have prior to V10? Well, in regards to NAS backup, not really much, but I just wanted to share that we kind of did have something, but not really at the level that we've just brought something out. So we had the ability to go file to tape. Now this was a one-off. This wasn't a scheduled or a very scalable or schedulable type operation. This was, we need to put this archive data onto tape, and then that's it for that. We also, in 9.5 update 4, so the beginning of 2019, we introduced NDMP to tape. So we did tick the box of saying we can leverage NDMP, but again, that gives us the same restore constraints that we just talked about, where we have to actually recover the whole entire volume, and we have to restore that ultimately back to its original location. What it also meant is that there is no single file or folder level recovery, so no granularity when it comes to that recovery. So if we look at the challenges overall now, couple those all together in that, how do we not only get from gigs to terabytes to also now petabytes of data and millions and billions of files that we have within our data sets? How do we scale our components? How do we make sure that that backup window is as small as it possibly can, and the most efficient way of being able to pull that data from A to B? How do we make it incrementally fast? So take a full backup on day one. We have to do that. We're not magicians yet. And how do we create a fast incremental backup forever? So what I mean by that is we take a full backup, but then thereafter we only take the changes since the last backup, and that's a continuous operation. We never have to go back and take that full backup again. Obviously, very important, we have to provide consistency of that data. We have to make sure that that is in a consistent state so that we can actually use it when it comes to recovery. And the biggest thing is, all of us could go to our boss. So if we can make something cheaper, that's only a good thing, right? So being able to provide the capability to you guys as customers to back up your NAS devices to the cheapest possible storage that you have available to you. So 3 simple mantras, and anyone that's been involved with Veeam from a more, I guess more of a higher level, have probably seen these 3 buckets or these 3 mantras that we have at Veeam. And the first one being simplicity. So I've defined these into what we mean by NAS. So everything that I talk about from a component point of view is software defined. So things like, and I'm going to touch on these components as we move through, but things like our file proxies, the file proxies that move data from A to B, they can be completely software defined. There's no hardware requirement for them. You don't have to go out and buy an appliance type solution to be able to scale up and scale out accordingly. Wizard-driven approach. Those that use Veeam, you know how simple it is to get things up and running, start backing up your workloads. I think Anton has said numerous times, and many other people within Veeam, is that it takes around 10 to 15 minutes to start protecting VM workloads within your environment. Exactly the same premise when it comes to NAS backup. It's all within that same Veeam Backup Replication, and gives you that easy, simple, wizard-driven approach to be able to do that. No complex configuration. So regardless of the size of business that you are, it looks exactly the same, and that's a big thing from Veeam generally across the platform. Is regardless of the size of the architecture that you have, we want to keep it as simple as possible. But also that leads us on to the next thing, is that it needs to be flexible, because an SMB, a commercial, and an enterprise, and potentially public sector all have different requirements, and they have different architectures and environments and layouts. So we need to be able to scale accordingly to them, and we need to be able to deliver that in a simple fashion. We also understand that there are multiple NAS sources out there. So you might be running just an SMB share, you may be running an FS share, but I probably most likely from research that we've been doing is that a lot of people also have Windows file servers, Linux file servers in the same fashion, but maybe presenting different file types to different areas of the business. And what we wanted to do is stay with that flexibility of being able to protect an agnostic source using our new NAS backup. Cloud ready, what do we mean by that? So when we get on to the next slide, I'm going to touch on what actually we can protect with this NAS backup. And as long as it's using the protocols that I touch on, so the SMB and the versions associated to that and NFS, then we could absolutely do that within the public cloud. So if we think like Azure file services, then we've got the ability to protect them using NAS backup as well. Agnostic, already touched on. There are many different NAS devices out there and different ways of being able to share and present your file share, your unstructured data to your business and to your users. We want to stay agnostic. Very much been a huge part of Veeam's Veeam's culture and upbringing is being able to provide that across the board, that agnostic approach. And finally on there is the flexible licensing. So I'm not going to get into too much of the licensing because I want to keep it as technical as possible. But what that flexible licensing means is it's associated to our Veeam universal licensing. And what that means is that for every one instance, you can protect 250 gig of source NAS data. And what that also means is that you can move that instance license is very flexible. So if you decide that you no longer want to protect that data, or you increase it, or you want to move that data from on premises and you want to push that into a public cloud-based file service, you can move that license with it. Whereas a lot of the competition, they will require another license to then start protecting the workload in a different location. That brings us on to the reliability. So reliability is kind of the biggest, the most important thing for us. We're in control of the last line of defense. We are we are looking after your data, and really we come into play when there's a failure scenario within your environment. So we have to be obviously reliable for that, which brings us on to things like fast recovery, being able to be granular in that recovery, being able to perform those fast incremental backups, which means that we're not encroaching on the performance of the production environment, and also being able to provide an indexed and searchable solution to your NAS backups. There's no good in just being able to back it up if you can't have a level of searchability or universal search into those workloads. Okay, so getting into the three key areas that we want to touch on from a NAS point of view is, first is I've mentioned around flexibility. So in terms of flexibility, we know that there's a lot of customers out there or prospects out there that have varying different NAS source solutions. SMB version 1, 2, and 3, NFS version 3 and 4.1, generally going to be more common. But then we also know that a lot of customers, and potentially Veeam customers, that are re-architected away from those NAS devices and pushed it into a Windows file server or into a Linux file server because they wanted to use image-based backups to be able to protect them. And this doesn't take that away. This is giving you a choice to choose whether you want to use NAS backup or whether you want to continue with your image-based backup. That's a decision to make within your environment. What this gives you is some pretty good performance against things like this change file tracking that I'm going to touch on in a lot more detail as we walk through this. But it's a choice that we wanted to give you guys to be able to define what you wanted to do and how to protect that. So change file tracking, again, I'm going to get into a lot more detail around this because this is really the huge differentiator that we have within the NAS backup. And this is what allows us to not only scale to petabytes and billions of files, but it also allows us to provide that fast incremental backup. And then finally is the snapshot friendly. So snapshot friendly, what do we mean by that? Is that there's a lot of NAS devices out there that have the capability of using storage snapshots or native storage snapshots. Now we can leverage those storage snapshots if we need to be able to protect the NAS device. What that then does is offload performance down to the storage snapshot. Most importantly, though, it means that we're not going to have to deal with any file locks. Now, if your NAS storage doesn't provide snapshots, then we've got options for you as well in regards to using VSS on our file proxy. But the being able to offload that down into a storage snapshot and potentially off to a secondary snapshot that's been replicated to a secondary NAS device is another way of being able to provide a way of not encroaching on the performance of the actual production. And then finally here is that we've really concentrated, as we always do at Veeam, is we've really concentrated on, well, how do you then recover that data in the fastest possible way? So whether that's an entire file share, whether that's a specific point in time, and I'm going to get into what that means and I'll demo this, and then that granularity, so being able to perform file level recovery for that as well. So entire file share, if you remember what I said about an NDMP challenge, was you've got to be able to restore that back to a similar vendor A, or you can't just put it to vendor B. It has to go back to the original or same location. That's not the case with NAS Backup from Veeam, is that we can absolutely recover from vendor A to vendor B or to vendor server, file server, etc. We can do that. We can be really flexible in where we recover that data to. The point in time is ultimately a differential restore. So we understand what's changed since the last backup. So it's just a quick rollback. We're going to roll back to the last known good configuration and get you back up and running as fast as possible. The ideal demo or solution there is around ransomware. You remediate the threat that you've had on your NAS device, and then you recover as fast as possible and get your data and get your users back up and running as fast as possible. Then we've got file level recovery. How do we go in and make sure that we can recover files and folders individually without having to bring back everything from wherever that repository is? So just to summarize on what those key differentiators are, change file tracking, we're going to get into that again in a few more slides. We're not leveraging NDMP. Now you can still use that NDMP to tape if that's the requirement. If you want to send that off to tape on a monthly basis, then absolutely it's still in the product. And it also doesn't contain there's no licensing for that. That's already included. So if that works, then great. But our NAS backup doesn't leverage NDMP. And agnostic. We're agnostic to not only what we pull the data from, but we're also agnostic as to where we store those backups. Okay, so before I jump in, I'm gonna just quickly, there's two questions that I saw. So Andreas asked, I see indexed and searchable. Do we need a SQL standard edition, I guess? No, so this doesn't leverage. So if you know Veeam Backup Replication, for image-based backups, we absolutely leverage SQL or SQL Express for storing all of our job and configuration and our database, our management. That's not the case for NAS Backup. NAS Backup is the best way of, or how we've created this, and I don't go into this much detail, is around it's a NoSQL database or a distributed file system that we're using, or distributed node architecture. So there is no licensing. You don't need SQL. We're not leveraging. So if you're just going to buy Veeam Backup Replication just for NAS, yes, there is still a requirement. You can still use SQL Express for that, but there's no load going to go into SQL in regards to NAS Backup. There was also a question around cloud tier. So I'm going to touch on what cloud tier means and what that looks like as a target repository as we walk through the components. So I think that's it for questions. Yeah, we're all good. Right. So Veeam NAS Backup components. So I kind of touched on already what we can back up. So think about this as the source. This is where your unstructured data already lives. We've got a varying range of different versions of SMB and NFS and different Windows file servers, Linux, etc. When we get to the demo, I'm going to show how easy it is to add those. Within that, we've got 3 different transport modes. Now, those familiar with Veeam, you'll know that we have transport modes that allow us to get data from A to B in the most efficient, but also the best performance possible. We have a similar method here with our NAS backup. So first up, we've got backup directly from the file share. So if you're exposing the UNC path, SMB over NFS or whatever protocol that is, then we can just go and grab that and we can pull the data through and we can just continue to use that. The issue with that is that any files that are open will be skipped and retried several amount of times, and you'll see that in the backup job when I show the demo. But yeah, it will ultimately give you a backup. Then we've got the ability to leverage a VSS snapshot on the file proxy. So I'm going to get into what the file proxy is and how it works shortly. And then that backup from the native storage snapshot. If your storage system or your NAS device allows for storage snapshots and they're visible, then we can absolutely leverage that as our source backup. Those that have a NAS device that it does expose storage snapshots, but it also enables remote VSS, then we, as part of that second option, we will leverage that as a source as well. So things like NetApp ONTAP, they support remote VSS. We can trigger that using that second option. We don't have to write any scripts or anything to integrate with. We just leverage that snapshot as the source at that point. Okay, so a new naming convention here. We have the concept of a cache repository. A cache repository is somewhere where we store the cache of the source file share. What this does is it stores the checksums of the file and folder attributes or folder attributes, things like modified date, created date, etc., that we just we need access to for that fast incremental backup. Now this cache repository is, and I'm going to show you what this looks like in the interface. It is just a repository. It's a simple repository that we're adding. The caveat that I would use here is that it should be as close to your source NAS shares as possible, and it should be on the highest grade or speed of disk that you could potentially throw at that. SSD would be optimal, but obviously not everyone has access to that. And it's generally, and this is me putting my finger in the air from a sizing, and there will be sizing calculators coming out around NAS backup, and some of you may have already seen this, is that this is generally around 5 to 10% of your source share in terms of how big that needs to be. But this is where the smarts of us being able to take that fast forward forever incremental comes in. So ultimately, yeah, so it stores those folder attributes. It's comparing the checksums of that. There's a vcache file that lives within that. And this really enables us to tick off 2 of those challenges that we touched on. So it allows us to process petabytes of unstructured data and also allows us to get to that fast incremental file level backup and ignore the files that haven't changed. So let's go into a little bit more detail around change file tracking. So on day 1, we have our NAS over on the left-hand side of the screen. You'll see that we've got our entry point, if you like, our share. We've got our folders, we've got our files within the folders. And on day 1, we're going to collect something called a vcache of that, and we're going to take that full backup. The cache repository instructs our file proxies, and I'll get onto that again in a little while. But ultimately, we create this hash sum of what that looks like on that day so that we can refer back to that on day 2. Let's say on day 2, we come back again and we've changed just one file. File D has been changed. What that's done is that will modify, and this is just the nature of file systems. It's going to change folder 3, it's going to change folder 1, it's going to change the top level source tree. It's going to change the folder attributes, which is then going to be reflected when we go and look at that top level folder. It's going to say something's changed. We're then going to go and look at folder 1, and we're going to go, something has changed. We're going to go down to folder 3, something has changed. And then we're going to get to file D, and we're going to go, right, that's the file that's changed. We only need to protect that. We only need to pull that out as part of our incremental. So what we do is our cache repository understands what folder and what files have changed, reflects that against the vcache, instructs our file proxy to then take the backup and send it to our short-term retention. Hopefully pretty simple stuff, and obviously all of this is happening behind the engine. So that then leads us on to the file proxy and the role of the file proxy. Proxy is something that we use quite a lot at Veeam. We have our VMware proxies, we have Hyper-V proxies. We literally have a proxy for many different, at least image-based backups that we have today. What this allows us to do is move data from source to backup target. And this then allows us to tick off additional challenges that we first mentioned. This is how we're going to scale the amount of concurrent throughput that we can get from source to target. And it's also going to provide us that data consistency and make sure that that data is in a good state. And what happens is that cache repository tells our file proxies, you need to take these backups and you need to send that to whatever repository that we've got defined for that short-term retention. Now, the story here is that on day 1, which is going to be your full backup, that's going to be the most amount of data, unless you're changing the whole NAS share on a daily basis, which is very unlikely. that is going to be the most load that is required to move data from A to B. What we can do, because we're completely software defined, is we can take resources that you have available and spin up these file proxies, potentially in an automated fashion. We have scripts available on Veeam Hub today that allows us to do this. The file proxy itself is required to be a Windows operating system. That can be a desktop version of Windows. It can obviously be a server with Windows Server with a UI, but it also can be server core. That cache repository will instruct as many file proxies as we want to be able to concurrently send that data from A to B. After that full backup, it's likely that your change rate is going to be a lot less. So you probably don't need to have all of that resource up and running, so you can scale them back. And the biggest benefit here is that you've not had to pay any additional hardware costs to scale up and get that speed of backup down. Now, you can tweak this. This can be modified, and we can ultimately script what that needs to look like from a dynamic proxy deployment point of view. These file proxies can also double up as VMware proxies. So it's just a service that runs on there. And it could also leverage other compute nodes that you have within your environment. And it also can be virtual, it can be physical. Obviously, from a virtual point of view, it's much easier for us to spin up, spin down, and be more dynamic, the nature of virtualization. And they can double up as that VMware proxy as well. But that allows us to get that concurrency throughput into our backup repository. So let's say that we have one file share. That short-term retention, we've got folder A, B, and C. The cache repository is going to instruct file proxy 1, 2, and 3 as to who's going to move what from A into our short-term retention. We're going to have a CRC check or a hash sum in that cache repository, and it knows that CRC A is going to go through file proxy A, CRC B through 2, and so on and so forth until we get the job done. And again, that could be scaled out accordingly, but what that means is that we have multiple concurrent tasks getting through the going through the file proxies. I'll just check whether there's any questions before we move on. So Isra, hi Mike, can one use the same NAS, which a VBR repo for NAS backup if it? So yeah, I'm going to touch on the repositories now. Obviously, don't get yourself into some sort of inception where if you're using a NAS repo, as in you're backing up to SMB or NFS, and you're putting your image-based backups there, you don't also want to have your production NAS files there. But we can absolutely use that as a repository. I'll get onto that as well. Another question, so from Michael, does change file tracking still work where the transport mode is backup from native snapshot? Yeah, absolutely. And that will use our own, that uses that same change file tracking. So yeah, 100%. Those 3 advanced transport modes, they all leverage the same change file tracking from us. Is the file proxy part of the Veeam application? Yeah, absolutely. So Mazar, yeah, it's just another component that you deploy as part of Veeam Backup Replication. So when you, I'll show you that when we get into Mohammed as well. You have NetApp NAS can be backup. So if you're talking about NetApp as a source, so you're storing your unstructured data on NetApp, on ONTAP, then yeah, absolutely, we can leverage. That's the whole point of Veeam NAS backup, is the ability to start protecting that unstructured data. Okay, I'll come back to the other questions in there. Let's get into where we can actually store these NAS backups. And the first thing to mention is that this isn't the same format. So you may have heard us, or may have heard us talking about our image-based backups, our VBK format, our VRB, VIBs, our portable data format. This is more of an object-orientated file format, if you will. Really, because when we get to that next slide, you're going to understand a bit more as to why we've done that. So it's a new NAS backup format. We can use the cloud tier. That was a question earlier. So we can absolutely use the cloud tier for our short-term retention. What we will do is, if you've got the capacity tier or the cloud tier terminology used within that for your image-based backups being tiered off into the public cloud or into object storage, we will just ignore that object storage from a NAS point of view. We have a retention based on days and months, and I'll get into a little bit more detail about that. This goes back to one of the questions: can we back up to the same NAS that we have for our VMware or our image-based backups? Yeah, absolutely. These are just repository types: direct attached storage, scale-out backup repository, as I just mentioned, NAS, SAN, dedupe. Yeah, they can all be used for that short-term retention. Generally speaking, and I'll touch on this again as we get into the demo, is that this should be the first port of restore. This should be as close to the production as possible. This should be that one, as minimum as 1 day's worth of retention, and we're generally seeing 1 to 7 to 14 to 30-day type retention being stored as close to the production as possible for that really, really fast recovery. Then we've got the ability to tier off. So this sounds very similar to what we do with cloud tier and our image-based backups, or capacity tier and our image-based backups, archiving older versions to cheaper storage. Now, the first thing that comes to mind here is object storage, and that's absolutely a viable solution here, but don't disregard the capability that we can leverage dedupe devices here as well for long-term retention. We can also use all of those other repository types that I just mentioned: direct attached storage, scale-out backup repository, NAS, SAN, etc., all being able to leverage that long-term retention. We've got the ability, so object storage is the big one here. It allows us to tier off into there for those older versions of files and folders. And yeah, this is where we're seeing that. This is where we're ticking that. How long do you need to keep that data for? Let's not keep it on that production or that short-term retention. Let's tier it off into older storage. So what do we mean by that? So if we look at the short-term retention, and generally speaking, on day one, we create a file version 1, very creative of me. We modify that on the second backup. We create version 2, version 3, and version 4. Then on day 5, because we've got only a 4-day retention that we want to keep in that short-term retention, version 1 then gets dropped down into our long-term retention. And that's only if they're modified. So if we take the example of an ISO in the source, we're going to obviously back that up. The short-term retention is going to keep all of the active files that are in the production as a way of being able to recover that data. An ISO doesn't get modified. There is no version 1, 2, 3, 4 of an ISO. It's very much a static file. And the only way that that's ever going to get down into long-term retention is if it's deleted from production. But we can also exclude things like an ISO file. But just to be aware that maybe you don't want us backing up those ISOs unless they're really important. That's kind of what the internet's for. Leave them out there, exclude them. We've absolutely got the ability to exclude files and file types from our backups. Don't waste the licensing around that. What we've also implemented is the ability to create a secondary copy of that NAS. So think about this as a disaster recovery solution. So a secondary copy in an offsite location, different location, with a completely different schedule, with a completely different retention, if you wish, as well as a separate encryption key. So we can encrypt our data from that short-term retention, and we can assign a key there. We can also assign a different key here to this secondary copy. So think about insider malicious activity. You may give access to one key for one admin and one key to another admin. They don't have access to both. So just to summarize what that looks like is, so file-based backup, obviously different file format, because we're looking at speed, we're looking at scale for this. We're only looking at folder attributes. We do not read the entire backups. That's important. We're using that vcache to understand what's changed since the last backup in comparison to what's there at the source. We can scale up to billions of files and petabytes of data. And we do have a level of compression built in. If I remember, I'll try and show that as part of the demo. Just to visualize another visualization of this. So typical file system, folder and file structure. Let's say that file 3.11 has changed, which then in turn indicates that the subfolder 3.1 has also changed and folder 3 has changed. When we come to do that pass of the backup on the schedule, then we're only going to take file 3.11. We don't have to go and walk the whole file and folder structure to understand what's changed, what's new, what's been modified. Okay, I'll just quickly jump into the questions. There's a few more coming through now. So VJ has just asked, will this software work with all NAS devices? Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the key differentiators for us, is this is completely agnostic. As providing it works over the protocols that I mentioned, the SMB and NFS, then we've got the capability of being able to protect that. Nuno, you asked are there advantages of having the proxy on the same machine of the Veeam backup? So yeah, you can absolutely do that. It's going to be very CPU intensive because it's going to be moving the data from A to B. But if you size it accordingly, then absolutely. Same as a VMware proxy. That can also sit within the same Veeam Backup Replication server. And yeah, so you could absolutely do that. They don't have to be a separate server. It's really going to come down to the size of the NAS source that you have. Didier, I think that's how you pronounce it. Could NetApp, SnapMirror, and SnapVault be used for a backup method? We can leverage that as providing that we trigger that from an orchestration script. And again, I'll show that as to where you'd define that. Right, let's get on to a bit more of the management. So I've kind of touched, and we already know about, so Veeam Backup Replication is the management hub, and I would say that probably 8 out of 10 of you that using Veeam are using Veeam Backup Replication to drive your schedules, to drive your backups, to drive your policies. But I wanted to use this to really touch on 2 other elements that have been advanced with NAS backup capabilities. One being Enterprise Manager and one being Veeam One. So Enterprise Manager is, for those that are not familiar, is our web interface, our overview of everything that we're doing from a Veeam Backup Replication server. Really ideal for distributed environments where you have multiple Veeam backup servers, for example. But what this gives is a web interface. You can define restore roles. There's an element of there's a dashboard. There's some element of reporting in here. But the most important thing here is this is how we're going to be able to search at a very fast rate those files and folders within your NAS backups, and then be able to then restore them from this interface as well. So it's another way of being able to recover workloads. Then Veeam One that I mentioned is there's a few monitoring or monitor aspects to this. Is what's our proxies doing? Do we have too many? Are we not utilizing them all? We have some alarms based on proxies and the connectivity of the proxies and the performance of those proxies, so you can understand and you can be quite dynamic on adding more proxies to adhere to the requirements. Then reports, how much data are we using? How much data are we protecting? Okay, so that was a short section, but I just wanted to highlight those 2 things. I think we don't shout about those areas too much. So Veeam NAS backup, and obviously I've mentioned around recovery being very important. So I already touched really on the entire share and being able to recover from where, or being able to back up from wherever and being able to recover to wherever as well. And that really could be taking it from SMB, sending it to a Windows file server, or vice versa. It could also, what you've got to bear in mind from a permissions point of view is, or an ACL's point of view, is that if you're taking it from NFS to SMB, then you're not going to have the permissions, the security controls around there. But we can absolutely do that as well. If it's just the raw files that you need, and then you're going to set different ACLs, then we can absolutely help there. We've got the rollback to a specific point in time, and that's what I'll demo in in the demo shortly. And then that restore individual files and folders. For those familiar, our Veeam Explorer gives us the capability of being able to go in and individually see, search, and view and restore those files and folders that you need. Okay, that's enough slides. That seems like a lot of slides. So hopefully, if I pivot over here, you will see my Veeam Backup Replication server with a load of NAS backups. First of all, what I want to show is where you add your shares. So first of all, under your inventory, this is where you're going to see your virtual infrastructure. You're going to see your physical infrastructure, and now you're going to see this file share. You click add file share, you see your file server, NFS shares, SMB shares, and you obviously click the appropriate one. You can see that I've got some already created. If I click on one of these, I can add them to a specific backup job from here. I can define where they reside in the world. So location tagging, things like GDPR or some sort of governance. We want to know where that backup is or where that source is. And then properties, this is the wizard that you're going to see when you add that SMB share. So point it to the UNC path. Now we have to provide some access credentials, and access is the key word there, is that this must define the capability of being able to read those files. Now, if it's only read, obviously when we come to recovery, we're going to need to provide better or more advanced security items to that. Now, when we go into advanced, this is where we've got those 3 advanced transport modes. Out of the box, it's going to be backup directly from the file share, but then you've got the other 2 options that you have in here. So if you wanted to leverage that remote VSS or file proxy VSS, then we can absolutely use that middle option, or we can back up from a storage snapshot. And this is where you define the path to that snapshot. So that snapshot needs to be visible to the file share, and we can fail over back to a whichever mode you require as well if one doesn't work. This is where we define a proxy. So if you have multiple proxies in multiple locations, your VBR is looking after multiple sites, we can define, or we could just say all proxies. This is where you define that cache repository. I'm going to touch on what that actually looks like from adding that as a repository. This is me just calling it a Veeam cache repository. It could be ultimately anything. Another important thing to mention here is this backup IO control. Those familiar with Veeam and they're potentially using Veeam in a virtualization manner with VMware, we already have backup IO control included that allows us to not encroach on performance of your production data stores. This is very similar, although it's not automated yet. So what this allows us to do is tone back how aggressively we're going to pull that data from the source to the target, really focusing on low-end NAS devices that do not have the performance spec that we require to be able to pull that data from. And we can be quite granular on where that lives. So over to the left is low-end NAS, and that's not me calling out anyone in particular. And then as we get up into the enterprise with enterprise-grade NAS devices, then we can absolutely go full throttle into protecting those workloads. We apply that, and that's it. That's adding a share. So let's quickly come out of there. If we want to have a look at the file proxies, you can see here that I have 4 file proxies that I've deployed and automated the deployment using PowerShell. So know that that's an option as well. And those scripts are available on Veeam Hub. But you'll also see here, so the name of these are 116. These are Windows Server Core systems. You're also going to see those same servers down here, and they're acting as my vSphere proxies as well, because ultimately it's just a service that we're using here. Backup repository for the cache repository, it really is just a simple repository that we've created. I'm going to say where it is, and it's actually just a direct attached storage on this box. I'm going to say where it is. We're going to say what we want load control to look like, what mount server, etc. So I just named that, and you can see that it's quite small in regards to from a capacity point of view. If we go now to look at our backup jobs, to create a backup job, you'll see our traditional image-based backups, virtual machines for VMware and Hyper-V. You'll see our physical agents for Windows and Linux, and now you're also going to see this file share. Now, if I open one here's one I made earlier. Again, we wanted to keep this as simple as possible. We wanted this to look and feel exactly like it does for our existing customers. So that's important that we brought that simplicity into that. So we give it a name. We then choose our file share. So if I go in here, that file share that I just added will come into this drop down. We can then define that, and we can say where we want that to be. Under here, this is where we can exclude certain masks. So if we said that we didn't want star.mp3s ever to be backed up, or star.isos as the example goes, then we can absolutely define that here. We can have multiple files and folders in there as well. This is where we define, under storage, this is where we define our short-term retention or our backup repository settings. So short-term, you can see here that I want to keep 7 days worth of active file versions as close to my production as possible. And in this instance, and this is a choice, you don't have to offload older files to any other location, but if you did want that longer term retention, we could absolutely do that. And this is where you define whether you want to keep previous file versions for 3 months, for potentially years. And this is where you define that archive repository. And you'll see that that list just got a little bit longer because I've got several object storage options in there. And then this is where we can get even more granular when it comes to active file versions, deleted file versions, but also let's say that we did disregard star.mp3s in the first pass of the backup. It might be that for longer term retention, we don't really need ISOs, or we don't need star.mp4s. So we can get really granular on what we actually protect here. Under advanced, this is where we define what permissions and attributes you wanna protect. So out of the box, it's going to be folder level only, because that enables us to be as fast as possible. But you can choose to store the file permissions. If you've gone that granular, then you want that option to be able to do that. This is where we define our compression level. So out of the box, it's set to optimal. This is also where you can set your own encryption to that backup file. We've got our health checks, we've got notifications. Now, if you wanted to drive a storage snapshot, then this is where you can define that within a script as well, to be able to drive that storage replication or storage snapshot replication, and then use that as the source. This is I wanted to show this as well. So I mentioned around the location tagging. Because I haven't defined it, it will come up and it will warn you that you don't have a location tagged to that. Under secondary repository, so if I just choose one, for example, I go in here, this is where we can have that secondary copy. Let's say this is for disaster recovery, offsite copy of that NAS data. We want to use a custom retention policy, and that could be very much different to what we have in production. We can then also set a different encryption setting. And very similar to our backup copy job is that we can define when you want that to happen, depending on your environment. And again, those familiar will absolutely understand the scheduling from a Veeam point of view. So we schedule the job. That's pretty much it from a configuration. So we can pretty much go from adding the share, which is very simple. We can add our file proxies, our data movers. We can define our cache repository where the changes are going to be stored. And we can then pretty easy create those backup jobs. So let's actually run through a bit of a failure. So I've got my NAS share here, and you can see it's promoting an old version, but Community Edition is still very, very much new. The free version, and this is a good plug, is that, well, if you wanted to test this NAS backup, then you can absolutely do so using the Community Edition. You get, I think it's 10 free licenses. So think about that 250 gig per instance. That's 10 of them. That's 2.5 terabytes. That's going to be more than enough for a test basis, for a proof of concept type manner. But yeah, what I wanted to show is everything looks good here. Text looks good. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to simulate a ransomware attack on that share. So run this. Now this won't be available. But what you're going to see here is that all of those modified. So if I open this now, we hopefully, and I don't think anyone should ever say that, we hopefully won't be able to read or see the images that we had in there. So this looks like a good opportunity for us to restore something from Veeam. Let's say that this was a ransomware attack. At this point, you may trigger another backup, but then you also might, because you'll see here that this one file was not affected. So it might be that we still want to protect that data. So let's take a restore point now. And let's say we've remediated that ransomware attack. So when it comes to recovery, we've got our restore tab, we've got our file share, and these are them three that we have. Now, the best form of remediation at this point is being able to roll back to a specific point in time. So I know that conveniently it's a backup job called ransomware demo quick. So we go in here and we choose that last restore point. We can search here as well, another thing that we don't really shout about, and people just adapt and use that. We load those restore points. Now up the top here, we can confirm whether the file, what folder and file, how far back do we want to go in terms of our restore. And you can see how quick that is, because we're not actually mounting any of the backup files at this point. We're just mounting the metadata that we're storing. So let's go back to that one. Okay, yeah. And what we're going to do is I'm going to open this while it's still running over here. And what you're going to see is that 156 date modified of all those files when our trusty ransomware file was run. Hopefully, if everything goes right from a live demo point of view, this will restore everything back from a last known good configuration, if you will, and all of the modified dates will just appear suddenly and everything will be back in business. So you can see that that's already happened. You can see it was very quick from that point of view. So let's open that and everything's back in business. Everything's back online. I've got 3 minutes left. So there's other demos out there. I did some at the V10 launch event. We went through actually using Alexa to drive that, just showing the extensibility of this. So yes, everything can be PowerShell driven as well as through this easy wizard driven approach. If we jump back into the slides for the last couple of minutes, those additional use cases, because of the nature of that entire file share restore being agnostic to where and where we recover it from or where we can recover it to, it's a great candidate. And this is something that we didn't even know about until it obviously goes out there to our customer base, is that actually it enables our customers to move from vendor A to vendor B. If you're going through a NAS migration from A to B, then you've absolutely got the chance to do that using this NAS backup tool. And the benefit of this is that if you're moving from vendor A to B and you've already got that backup job already functioning and you move over, that cache file that we've touched on from a change file tracking will continue to work and will continue to like the incremental is still there. You don't have to then go and take a full backup, which is pretty smart in my opinion. There's a lot more. Obviously, I can't go through everything. I've only got an hour to touch on, but there is still, so there's a big focus. I tried to touch on everything: the backup copy, the being able to tier to S3. We touched on the encryption keys, SMB mapping, security attributes, things like access control, location tagging. I touched on full PowerShell support, etc. These are really the key areas that I kind of want you to remember. Software defined. We don't have an appliance. You bring the compute and memory, and that's what enables us to drive that scale and that performance for those NAS backups. And then the biggest ask is, like, if this is of interest, the community edition is out there. Download that, have a play with it. It looks and feels exactly the same as the normal version. It gives you a lot of functionality to be able to start protecting those workloads. Couple of minutes left, so I'm going to just quickly go through some of these questions. So, good question, Mart. How about tape for long-term and offline storage? So that long-term retention repository, there's options that we're absolutely exploring as to whether we can go to tape, whether we can go to different media types, whether we can go to our Cloud Connect service providers. So we're absolutely looking into that. Another question in regards to compression and dedupe. So for NAS backup, there is no deduplication. What we have seen is when we're actually storing those backups to a dedupe device with our integrations, we're seeing a really good, like 8-to-1, 80% type reduction in storage. But again, that's a kind of a loose number because your mileage is going to very much depend on what that data set is. Remco, is it possible to exclude folders? Wasn't possible up to V9. So I don't believe so. I think it's just file types that we're able to exclude. It may be possible to exclude folders from, let's have a look. The beauty of live demo means that I can just quickly jump in. I can look here. I can see what we can exclude. So yeah, you can see, in fact, I'm pretty sure if I was to just go like DC1 share CAID, which would ultimately be the whole share, I can exclude that as a folder, but that's particular for NAS. I've been told by support that you can't use a backup copy job to rotating drives with data from NAS backup. Is that going to change? Potentially. I'm not aware of really what's coming down the line on that front. If you can answer when appropriate, what size or chunk size are the backup objects sent to target storage and is configurable? So yes, in fact, so the question was, what size or chunk size are the backup objects sent to target storage and is it configurable? Not easily configurable, and I don't know how much I can say about things like registry tweaks. Ultimately, what we're going to do, we're storing, in fact, I've just done a YouTube video that will be available that goes into the file and folder structure, as well as an overview and a real deep dive into what that looks like, what the what the NAS backup format actually looks like. I'll try, so keep an eye on Veeam's YouTube. It's going to be there. It's actually on mine at the moment, so it's available. If you go and search for Michael Cade on YouTube, you'll see my channel, and there's a few little behind the scene type looks at NAS backup. Good question there from someone around how to restore the secondary copy. So let's say your Veeam Backup Replication lives in your primary site and your primary site is under water, or you have no access to it, you can't get in remotely, but you have your data in that secondary location. How can you import that data into a new Veeam Backup Replication server? I think that's what the question is. Then spin up a new Veeam Backup server, and there is an import function of those file types within that new Veeam Backup. So yeah, although I said it's not the portable data format that we know from a VBK point of view, it's still very portable. You're not required to have that same Veeam Backup Replication server. Okay, so good question. Does it work with the S3 API if we have on-prem object storage that uses S3 out? Good question, Michael. Yeah, absolutely it does. So it's exactly the same S3 option or object storage options that we have from a backup repository point of view. So on screen now, you'll see S3 compatible, Amazon S3, Microsoft Azure Blob Storage, IBM Cloud Object Storage. So yes, if you're running an S3 compatible object storage on premises, then we can absolutely use that as a long-term retention repository. Good question again from Michael. Any Ansible playbooks being written or available from an automation perspective? In particular to NAS, we're working on some things around automation. there is some pretty funky Ansible playbooks out there already in general for Veeam Backup Replication, things like being able to actually just spin up Veeam Backup Replication from scratch using Ansible. So from a configuration management point of view, as well as Chef and Puppet as well for that matter. Pranav just asked how to create a backup proxy. Yeah, absolutely. So if we jump into backup infrastructure, if we go to backup proxies, if we go right click there or add proxy up the top, you'll see add your vSphere, add your Hyper-V, file proxy, choose your server. It needs to be in as a managed server. Choose your concurrent tasks. It's based on CPUs, as I mentioned. You've got the ability to set traffic rules, review them, and the summary of that. So pretty simple stuff. Michael again. Good question and good. It shows that you were paying attention. You saw a mutable NAS backup in the presentation. Is this something available? No, unfortunately not. This is me running some tests to see if we could have that. It's absolutely something that we're looking at though, to make those immutable. The other option is around different file systems that you can protect that to. Just conscious of time. So yes, the presentation will be made available later. Vladimir, you asked whether NetApp shares will be supported or will they work? Yes, absolutely. If they're using SMB, if they're using a version that we were able to, yeah, you probably saw that I do have some, yeah, I have a NetApp test VSS in there because that leverages the remote VSS that NetApp provide. Good question, Neil. Will there be native integration for Trend Micro when it comes to scanning restore files prior to the restore? I assume you're looking or asking something around secure restore. So great feedback is that yes, so we're looking into that. I can't promise when or if that will come, but yeah, that's absolutely something that we're looking at. And then just a final question before I have to close this down before GoToMeeting kicks us out is how many file proxies do I need for my environment? Is there a calculator for it? Yeah, so we're really working on those calculators. We're very close. The big thing around calculators is that we need field experience. We need best practices as well before we can define what those look like. But your SE could absolutely help you in regards to that. I think that is probably it. Israel, you asked about catalog search. Yeah, so we absolutely index everything. It's searchable. It's not the same catalog that we use for image-based backups. Those that remember I mentioned around a NoSQL or a distributed node architecture that we have there, that's exactly what we use to be able to search fast against that. Mike, does the NAS file share need to be formatted using a specific file system? No, it's really as long as the protocol that you're exposing them out is supported, that gives us the ability to protect those sources. Hopefully that helps, Israel. Good question. So Ian asked another question around, will file share backup work for Windows DC, saving Active Directory objects? So this is where I really wanted to define what structured and what unstructured look like. My opinion, and yeah, absolutely, if it's exposed via SMB, yeah, we can protect it. But ultimately, an image-based backup is always going to give you the best restore capabilities when it comes to protecting that structured data. Active Directory is a database. It's going to be very much structured. So leverage our image-based backup tools, our agents, or our virtualization approach to those. Another question around the backup format. I think I answered this. There's a YouTube video available on that. But if you just wanted to see what it looks like under the short-term retention, you see, let's use this one as an example. We've got our vStore, and again, yeah, there's lots of new .vstores or vcache or vblobs, I think. But if we go into these, you're going to see a lot of meta and metadata, v indexes, etc. I actually, that video on YouTube will go into a lot more detail around that. Really, like, that's awesome passion to hear people wanting to understand that. But really, this is it's not hidden away at all. You can obviously go in there, but the simplicity is brought to the front for the majority of our customers. So just so they can, it just works type mantra. Yeah, and with that guy, again, if I didn't answer your questions, then either ping me, and I'm on Twitter. You've got my email address. It's michael.cade@veeam.com. Feedback is important as well. I want to understand what you guys are doing out there, as well as, so a really quick response though will be on Twitter if you're on there. So @MichaelCade1, and probably even quicker will be go to your Veeam SE, go to your sales guy, understand, like get in front of them. They'll be able to help. Hopefully that was a good one. Cheers guys, thank you very much.